The Dongji Rescue, a symphony of humanity. What does it mean to be human when faced with absolute inhumanity? In 1942, that question was answered in the cold waters of the East China Sea. For the men aboard the torpedo transport ship, the Lisbon Maru, the answer from their Japanese guards was clear. They were disposable. As the ship sank, the hatches were sealed, and those who escaped were met with machine gun fire. But from the nearby shores of Dongji Island, a different answer emerged. An answer from Chinese fishermen who saw not enemy soldiers, but men drowning. In an act of stunning bravery, they launched their boats into the chaos, defying their occupiers and the bullets in the water. This isn't just a story about a shipwreck. It is the story of a moral choice. A choice between looking away and risking everything for a stranger. It is the story of the Dongji Rescue, where the quiet courage of a few became the last best hope for hundreds. The floating tomb. In the vast, indifferent theater of the Pacific War, countless tragedies unfolded, many lost to the depths of the ocean and the fog of history. One of the most harrowing was the story of the SS Lisbon Maru. In the autumn of 1942, this was no ordinary vessel. It was a Japanese hell ship, a floating prison commandeered to transport human cargo. Crammed into its dark, suffocating holds were over 1,800 British prisoners of war, captured after the fall of Hong Kong. Their destination was Japan, where a life of brutal forced labor awaited them. The conditions below deck were a vision of Dante's Inferno. The salt-laced air was thick not with the scent of the ocean, but with the stench of dysentery, disease, and despair. Men were packed so tightly they could barely sit, let alone lie down. Rations were scarce, a slop of rice and water, and medical care was non-existent. Fear was a cold and constant companion, but beneath it simmered a fragile camaraderie, a shared understanding of their grim fate. Above them, their Japanese captors walked the decks, indifferent to the suffering festering below. The Lisbon Maru was not just a ship. It was a coffin in waiting, slowly charting a course across the East China Sea, carrying souls already suspended between life and death. For these men, hope was a currency they could no longer afford. A single torpedo, 1,000 fates. On the morning of October 1st, 1942, the fate of every man aboard the Lisbon Maru was sealed by a force that was entirely unaware of their presence. The American submarine USS Grouper, patrolling the waters, spotted the Japanese vessel. The ship bore no markings to indicate it carried prisoners of war, a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention. To the Grouper's commander, it was simply an enemy transport, a legitimate military target. A single torpedo was fired. The explosion tore through the ship's stern with a deafening roar. For the prisoners in the holds, the violent shudder that ran through the vessel was, for a fleeting moment, a spark of hope. Was it rescue? Liberation?
Rescue?
The reality was far more terrifying. The ship was critically damaged and began to list, taking on water. Panic erupted, but it was the actions of the Japanese guards that turned a maritime disaster into an act of profound cruelty. Instead of attempting a rescue, the Japanese soldiers battened down the hatches, sealing the prisoners in their dark, flooding tomb. They then abandoned ship, taking to the lifeboats alongside an escort vessel, leaving over 1,800 men to drown. The hope of rescue had vanished, replaced by the chilling certainty of a watery grave, the will to live. Trapped below deck, as the cold seawater rose around their ankles and then their knees, the prisoners faced a stark choice: surrender to the inevitable, or fight for a final, desperate chance at life. They chose to fight. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, the senior British officer, knew there was no other way. With bare hands, makeshift tools, and sheer adrenaline-fueled determination, the men began to assault the hatches. The splintering of wood was the sound of defiance, a primal scream against their fate. Finally, they broke through. Men surged onto the listing deck, gasping for air, their eyes blinded by the daylight. But their ordeal was far from over. The Japanese escort vessel, the Toyokuni Maru, circled nearby. Instead of offering aid, its crew opened fire with machine guns on the helpless men struggling in the water. It was a massacre. Men who had survived the torpedo and the suffocating hold were now being systematically executed by their supposed guardians. They swam through a sea of bullets and bodies, clinging to debris, their strength failing. As they looked towards the horizon, they saw not a rescue fleet, but the faint, misty outline of a nearby island. It was a sliver of hope in an ocean of death, the lanterns in the storm. That faint outline was Dongji Island, part of the Zhoushan archipelago. Its inhabitants were simple Chinese fishermen, living under the heel of Japanese occupation. They had heard the explosion and watched the unfolding horror from their shores. They saw the ship sink, and more horrifyingly, they saw the Japanese soldiers firing on defenseless men in the water. In that moment, they faced their own choice, one that pitted their innate humanity against the mortal danger of defying their occupiers. Humanity won. As night began to fall, the fishermen, men and women alike, launched their small wooden sampans into the treacherous waters. They lit lanterns, tiny beacons of courage against the vast darkness of the sea and the greater darkness of war. They rowed towards the desperate cries for help, ignoring the risk of Japanese patrols. They pulled exhausted, shivering British soldiers from the water, offering them not just a place in their boats, but a warmth that had been absent for so long. They shared their water, their scarce food, and the shelter of their humble homes. This was not a military operation. There were no orders, no strategy. It was a spontaneous symphony of compassion, an act of pure, unhesitating grace performed by ordinary people who saw fellow human beings in peril and refused to look away. An unbreakable bond. In total, the brave fishermen of Dongji Island rescued 384 British prisoners of war. It was an act of staggering courage that came at immense personal risk. For days, the villagers hid the survivors in caves and attics, nursing them back to health, all while Japanese soldiers scoured the island. Though many of the rescued POWs were eventually recaptured, the actions of the fishermen were not in vain. They had affirmed life in the face of death and light in the face of darkness. The story of the Lisbon Maru and the Dongji rescue was suppressed for decades, a painful memory overshadowed by larger geopolitical narratives. But it was never forgotten by the men who were saved. Survivors like Dennis Morley dedicated their lives to ensuring the world knew of the Chinese fishermen's heroism. In recent years, the story has finally received the recognition it deserves. Memorials have been erected, and the descendants of the POWs have traveled to Zhoushan to meet the families of the fishermen who saved their fathers and grandfathers. An unbreakable bond was forged in the chaos of that terrible day. A bond not of nations or armies, but of shared humanity. The Dongji rescue remains a powerful, poignant testament that even in the deepest abyss of human cruelty, the courage and compassion of ordinary people can shine with the brilliance of 1,000 suns.